Hello. Good evening. So here's the way it's going to go. I will say absolutely nothing now, and then we will speak about the film or about other things surrounding the film or surrounding filmmaking later. The only thing is to just say that it's my first feature film, almost, 96, so it's been quite a while. And it's interesting for me to screen this film now, I think from quite a few perspectives. One of them is the context itself, the social political context of when it was made. But I think for me personally, is because it was, it's the cinematographic significance of a filmmaker who doesn't really know much yet about the world of producing, but produces his first film, about a filmmaker who wants to do all attempts and wants to show all he's capable of showing, of making errors, of experimenting. I think the main significance for me personal is that this is a film I produced because really nobody wanted to produce me. And the result is I was absolutely free, completely, to do whatever it is I wanted to do. It's something that now when I look at is really hard to get again, since as you grow older and more mature, you are being taken by the grips of the production world and the politics and the economy that comes around it. So the struggle actually becomes harder, not easier. So enjoy, and you'll see my parents in the film, you'll see my friends, you'll see my house, my parents' house, you'll see my own house when I rented it when I was living in Jerusalem. So you'll see a lot of personal things, including myself when I was with some black hair. Thank you, enjoy it.
Maybe you can start with a question about the last sequence, which is a good lesson. I think it's a good beginning for a masterclass about pictures and the way people look at pictures. As you know, I think you know, and I think you've said in interviews that this last image of the Israeli flag on TV and the Israeli hymn shouting in the house had been taken as, had been heavily criticized. Actually, I've heard some remarks to that effect, but heavily criticized by people not even noticing that, that your parents are sleeping in front of the TV, that they're not even looking at it. So maybe it's a question of what to do with images, what to do with pictures if people can't see them.
Yes, but one has to be specific about the criticism. It was not even a criticism, it was a fatwa. But it was a fatwa coming from the Arab world, from the juntas of the Arab world, from the governments at this moment. This is long ago. And it was basically promoted by critics who were being paid by the juntas. And in the, but this is too complex to explain exactly and make it very short on this level of explaining that in 1948 there was, after the grand expulsion of the Palestinians from their land and from their homes, there remains 100,000 due to a ceasefire who were given the chance to either follow their Palestinian brothers or to remain and receive Israeli identity cards by obligation. And these 100,000 people are today a couple of million living Palestinians inside Israel who don't feel particularly any kind of affiliation with the state of Israel. They just feel Palestinian and oppressed with a very dramatic practice of racism, expulsion, which continued in the 50s, imprisonment and basically surveillance during the first 20 years, military government for a couple of decades. And so the first part of the film is about this segment of the Palestinians. The second segment is about the Palestinians in Jerusalem. Now, this first segment, the Arab world did not even know, some of them, that there were Palestinians left, and to some of them, they were considered as betrayers, people who stayed in Israel, rather than look at them as people who stuck to their identity and their land. But this propaganda has been actually, been propagated by the Arab junta regimes themselves, were kind of co-producers of the 1948 diaspora. They collaborated entirely with Israel and as to give away Palestine. My film, this shot in particular, they just didn't get it. They thought I was basically raising the Israeli flag, that I was a collaborator, that I was somebody who was a surrenderer, etc., etc. There's pure ignorance, in fact. In Israel itself, where they read the film in the sophisticated fashion it should be read with, the critics wrote more about their own anguish regarding this image. They understood it very well. And they wrote, one critic I remember wrote that this image deserves a very strong Israeli defense army to fight. So this was the two, but it was not a general critique.
Okay. Well, to come back to the overall situation of the film, I think for your first feature, you certainly did not choose the easy way out. It seems you had done, I think, 2 short films in the States. I've seen one of them a long time ago in a festival. Invitation to the End of a Discussion.
Introduction to the End of an Argument.
Sorry. Yeah. And
Damaged by Assassination.
Yes. And later, after this film, I think you did another one for Arte called The Arab Dream. After this one, yes. And both are more like something that could be called a film essays. And then to do this film, you choose a very personal way of storytelling. In the first place, you're coming back from exile to make this film, or you're making this film when returning from exile, which already is something difficult. In the second place, you choose stories that come out of your own personal experience or your own personal story, in at least certainly in the Nazareth segment. Thirdly, I'm sure I'm forgetting things. Thirdly, you're putting yourself in the film, which is not the easiest thing to do for a first feature. Fourth, you're making a humorous film about a tragic situation. Five, I think I can stop here, but there are more.
Okay, let me just say, to start with deconstructing some of your question. First of all, I didn't return from exile. That's maybe just the pretext of the film. I was going back and forth quite a bit. These tableaus that I've written in were not written exactly, I could claim that 90% of whatever you saw in the film is either stuff I've witnessed or stuff I listened to, and some stories that I heard from my brothers and from close friends that I've turned into a cinematographic or sort of aestheticized cinematographic image. Humor is not a strategy. I think it was really, I'm trying to remember, and I think I started to speak about that earlier, the context of what it is I was trying to do. And I think it starts from an absolute will and desire to build a non-linear narrative that would present a kind of, let's say, a new cinematographic language that could be an alternative to that which existed back then, as to do with representing stories that had to do with Palestine, Israel. And I think it was also just my way of wanting to express myself. I had a great, well, I had faith that constructing a film from such tableaus, which would describe maybe the daily life, but also the absurdity of being there, would be done as such. I was not absolutely certain that this was cinema that would be consumed very fast. But I had the feeling that this was exactly what I wanted to do, and so I strongly believe that this was a form of storytelling I wanted to do now. Regarding why I was in front of the camera, it actually started with a short film that I did in New York, which was called Homage by Assassination. And I had never acted, but I put myself in front of the frame because I thought at that moment I was looking for an actor, and then I've decided that since this actor I was looking for is somebody who's going to be this sort of alter ego, such as what happens with other filmmakers, they choose one main actor that does that. But I've decided to actually do the stripteasing myself, last minute. So I didn't know how to act or how I should act. And I just put myself in front of the screen and I sort of set, the tone of the film. And when this film was finished, it was certain for me that if I was going to do personal or semi-biographic films, that it was I who had to be there. And it was not exactly casting myself. It was practically what went hand in hand with the aesthetic concept of the film. So at this moment, my thinking, and I think it was right, that this film without me being in it would not be the same film. And the fact is, then I made all the other decisions, for example, in this film, is rather than put actors that would act my parents, I actually asked my parents to be in the film. Rather than do the same thing with actors, to do my friends, it's my friends who were in the film. So it just went on the blurring border between fiction and non-fiction, not documentary, non-fiction. In this film, every single word has been actually scripted, but I wanted to bring it as close as possible to seem in the realm of the real. Even cinematography, even the shooting itself. For example, I've used huge amounts of light to film the house in order to light every single spot, in order to give that kind of sensation that you are being there, that you are not being a voyeur, that you are almost inside that space. It was all just having faith that this would work. I was not absolutely in the certain. It was my first film, and it was too big for me to start a film as such, so many locations. But what is interesting, I came in and out to try to remember, also in case something comes up in my mind. The other thing that really was, you needed to have either you have to be crazy or you have to have balls. I think I was crazy. For example, I structured the film in 2 segments. The first segment was all these scenes that I have written in, some of them without an order, just tableaus, with choreographies in them. But I didn't really have a plot. I didn't have the sort of what happens then. And so I've decided to cut the production into 2. One, which I would shoot all of these scenes, And another where I told the production that I will be waiting while shooting the film for something to happen, an accident. I remember clearly, I said, I'm waiting for an accident to happen. And this accident will be the seed for the film inside the film, for the plot of the film, which I didn't have. Of course, that is crazy to ask a production to do, because it meant sending everybody away, which is very expensive, and also it makes a sort of a chaos inside. And I happened to be inside, here, where I watched the scene actually that made me discover the film inside the film. It was when the police comes to urinate on the wall in between missions. And if you notice, the walkie-talkie drops from the last guy, And this was an accident. We had already did 10, 12 takes. Most of them were good, but I was still obsessively reshooting the scene. And the line producer was telling me, but you've got the take. And I said, no, I want to continue shooting. Unconsciously waiting for something to happen, and then the walkie-talkie dropped. And I said, okay, now you can break the set, everybody can go home, send all the crew, home to France and all that. I said, I have the story of the film. And the story of the film was that my character finds the walkie-talkie, and then what he does with it is he brings it to this girl who makes a kind of a live theater and gets arrested for it. And I went to a place for 3 weeks, and I wrote this, what you saw, all of this segment with the police, where she plays with the police. And maybe that's quite an interesting situation that actually I don't think one can repeat simply because it's terribly costly, and second because it's terribly risky to do. But maybe that's exactly what I was starting to speak or hinted to in the introduction of the film, is when you have that kind of space to actually experiment, you come out with images that do not necessarily have to do with the consumption of a direct traditional narrative, but have something to do with stories inside stories that are, of course, by all means, are by subliminal montage, are linked absolutely to each other, simply because we are shooting in a particular moment, in a time and space that is definitely, connected. This is, the area where things are happening. So every choreography inside is related to the scene after. So it makes a story that the author does not necessarily always have the control of, but somehow lets it be there because of that poetic space in between the scenes. So it creates its own accident, and it becomes itself the poetic site without any particular involvement of having to construct a traditional narrative about the person who comes back from abroad and he, witnesses this and this and that, so to speak.
I think it's not only the case with the madness of your project, or even with the flaws, the possible flaws in the film that you mentioned, but it's also a way of making films to work from a very strong structure and then finding freedom, and then miracles will happen in this case. But for instance, did you move around the episode very much in the editing? Did you have those post-it that you have in Divine Intervention? You have post-it on your wall with the sequences and you move them around. You do that?
In the script form, not in the editing.
Not in the editing.
No, in the script form I played a lot. I think in every film script that I write, I face always the same problematic. Halfway through the script, I face a certain monotony as far as the context of a feature film. That means if you continue like that, you only have tableaus. There is no up and no down. So there's always a need for this kind of pretext, this pretext that is not necessarily inherent in the choreography or in the poetic, but it's definitely something one looks for in order to have the spectator sort of have a little time off and continue in the sort of up and down, if you want the parameter for that, to reach a kind of slow, gradual ending of the film. But I think this problematic exists only in the feature film context. If you are making an experimental film, you don't need that at all. You can just do whatever you want to do. But within a certain level of budget and within a certain level of looking for producer, you end up being asked, what is the story of this film? In my case, I do not find the story of this film. I look for a pretext of a story for a film in order to continue simply with the tableau. So my concentration normally is on the actual tableau itself. Then, what I do is I stick them on the wall and I start to imagine them and see where they would cut well, not necessarily in continuity, but in that kind of poetic montage. So, I mean, there's certainly very little to do in terms of direct continuity. For example, the scene where my character is supposed to give a talk about his film, and then the mic starts to go wild. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with the scene of the police urinating on the wall. But it somehow cuts well, you know, it has that montage element that works in terms of a narrative. So this is basically the way I work, is I imagine them while I stick all of these little yellow cards on the wall. And then, of course, you continue to do that in the editing room, but it's not like I shoot stuff and then I edited it. No, there is already a ready structure. Let's say most of the structure of the film is already there before I start to film.
You've spoken a lot about, you've mentioned choreography a lot, or several times, but what about comedy? You're using several comedy devices. Not only, the film is not only a humorous film, but it's also using comedy devices, as the fact that you don't speak a word all through the movie, the fact that things happen 3 times, which is one of the basic rules of comedy, etc., etc.
I think for everybody who practices or takes a leap into the cosmos of art, film, writing, does not strategize. I think what you do is you throw yourself in a place where there is a seeming chaos. But somehow, if you have faith in your leap, that you are being sincere to yourself and that you are being faithful to the potential spectator you are trying to communicate with, this puzzle somehow reorganizes itself in this space without gravity, and it starts to float with a certain harmony. The fact is, I never utilize anything. I simply do what I do because of the sense that this makes absolute sense in terms of its poetic potentiality. The fact that I use humor, it's not even the use, it's just personal. It's who I am. It's probably who I was brought up like. So, in other words, if you're not funny, you just don't do it. It's better. I think the animation, what I'm calling the choreography, is simply because this is exactly what attracts me when I'm sponging the ambience in front of me. If I'm sitting somewhere and I'm watching animation, and sometimes something clicks in terms of the movements in front of me, and what happens is it creates a little tickle inside of me, and I start to imagine the potentiality of this animation becoming, let's say, transformed into an aesthetic dimension. Sometimes this happens when I'm sitting in a cafe, sometimes it happens when I'm taking my walks, sometimes it's indirect vision of what I'm seeing, or in a later phase. If I put a note that I saw something that was intriguing, it can come back to me, and it can also start by a minimal action, and then it starts to construct itself with my help, and it becomes maybe more complex. It can be that can be animation or choreography, and it can be also a gag. It can be something burlesque. It doesn't all come in front of me. Maybe the hint is what sparks the idea, and then an accumulation of different things happening, or my involvement in trying to see how it can become a punchline, is what you engage when you work on the script. You start to simply imagine, if it's just you laughing at your own joke, or if this is a complex set of an animation that is producing a harmony that you have faith is in communication with other people. In other words, you have to have that faith that it's not you who's just imagining, it's all the rest of the people who are going to be watching this scene who are also imagining. And if you don't have that faith, then you're laughing at your own joke, and this doesn't work. So that's why you have to go back and forth all the time to see if you're not just, throwing a cliche, that you are not actually doing something déjà vu, that you are actually not doing something superficially composed. So it involves then this kind of constant inner voyage that you have to take, imagining and imagining and imagining the same scene with plus or minus, until you see that there is something visually ripe, let's put it that way, in between brackets, that you see that it has suddenly the weight of a cinematographic scene, and also the weightlessness, that humor can carry with it. And if you have that sense, then of course it doesn't end there. You still have to go and shoot it and see if it actually works in the limitation and the possibilities of the space that is offered to you. And if that also works, then you go to another level, which is in the editing room, and then you start to play with all the sounds that are in front of you or on the sides that we don't see, etc., etc., and then it becomes a scene. So, I think that maybe people who paint maybe have similar experience when they start to pigment, when they start with the drawing and they decide to actually start to add layers and then scratch off some and then add them again. Go into the depth of field and see what's happening in different corners of the frame, simply because, for example, again, no strategies, but it doesn't fulfill me. I am not contented when there is one center to the image that I'm composing. I'm always yearning to have different platforms and different foreground and background, in order to have a potential, or in order to have the spectators, let's say, liberty and democratic position to actually look either in one place or in another, or to look one screening in one place and then the second viewing to look at another. In other words, I think it has something to do with what I could say in rhetoric terms, but it's something that I believe in that I don't remember when I work at all, which is that you make a film and a film is expensive. And so you better also thicken that image to have it potentially be screened and looked at more than once, rather than just experience a one-night stand with it. The reason why I don't make so many films, just the last bit is, yes, when I finish a script, it takes 2 years after to actually put the finances together. So 7 years is what I spend in between one film and another. 5 of them because I have to live in order to write, because I write things that come from absolute eyewitness, or let's say from experience. Because they are personal films, I cannot grab them from many other places. So I need to actually have lived experience in order to actually come up with these kinds of moments. That takes time, of course, unfortunately, but it's needed. And then once that is done, when you are feeling, and that's a very important moment, I don't make a film just because I like to make films. I make them when I feel they are necessary to be made. that is a sensation that grows in you once you feel the weight of it on you. That means you work and you work and you work, and there is a moment that you start to feel that you absolutely now have to make this film. When you have that feeling and that sensation that you now have to act, there is the unfortunate aspect that you have to go through the finance, that so many times I don't bother with until I feel that necessity. So that will drag on and lingers for a couple of years because of the world of finance is what we all know, and I think it's very important to speak about.
Yes. Well, would you feel now, sorry, excuse the question, would you feel right now the need to make such a film about your homeland, and how would you go about it in the present situation, present time?
Well, I never really make a film about my homeland. Even the films that I make are just happening in the homeland. And with the homeland, with a big question, I think the homeland is the film that I make. I think when I make a film in my homeland, I think that film is simply a microcosm of the universe that it's trying to describe. In other words, if that moment that I'm describing is not being absolutely sensed and identified and lived with by a spectator living in Finland, then that film should stay in the homeland because it's provincial and should not be actually exposed. The film that has to be exposed is the film that has the universality in that immediate sense, what we call cinema. Cinema does not have borders. I think cinema does not stop at checkpoints. It has to transgress all borderlines. In that sense, it's just the contrary. I think what makes it more interesting is to make a film in my homeland that actually can be identified in all the homelands that more or less today I can say are having to go through exactly the same experiences as my homeland, because what the Palestinians are experiencing today are being experienced in their different colors and modes in so many places in the world. I think that's what is happening already for a while, but it's taking some people some time to acknowledge that it's not specific to just one locale. Now, of course, one can say that the fashion that it's happening in Palestine is quite particular because it's maybe one of the, if it's not the only occupation that's still around, and that maybe this is the next much more sophisticated mode of apartheid that exists today. That the fact that, well, the fascism in Israel is quite unique in a sense. It has its own sense of specialness in the way it wants to utilize brutality. Yes, all that is true, but finally you don't go there to just make a film about it. You come to actually have an ambience that actually resonates in the rest of the world, because I think what's causing what's happening in Palestine is not necessarily to do just with what Israel is doing to Palestine on its own, but again with all the co-producers that are helping it to do what it's doing, if I may say. By the way, I'm not making a film, sorry to add this part, but my next film might be somehow the reverse formula. It will be, rather than Palestine being a microcosm of the world, it will be the world as a microcosm of Palestine. This is where we are at today.
Right. Maybe we have time for a couple of questions. I'm sure there are. Are there questions in the audience? I haven't looked at the audience during the whole thing, so maybe no. No questions. If not, we can switch to the next show. I don't know whether we have to go out and back in, or if we can go on to the Metropolis show. 5 minutes.
Actually, I'm supposed to also introduce that next.
Yes, that's why I was suggesting that we remain seated here.
But I'm not so sure anybody wants to be in the next film, so I think I'm going to have to wait till. But just in association, I think I've contributed to introduce the next film simply for one reason. It's not because I'm a film historian. and I actually am so far from being one. It's just because of part of what I was saying. I think I've seen this film some 25 years ago, I think more. And what struck me in it is the choreography. Actually that's maybe what stayed with me from that film. Of course, the film is not about that. It has much more than just choreography. But I remember when I watched it, I think it sort of influenced me quite a bit in the way many times I put in order some of the things that happen in front of the frame, like evenness of some sort. Many times people doing the same thing at the same time. In my case, I try to draw humor from it, but nonetheless, it actually definitely has something to do from watching many films that have these kinds of symmetry, if you like. And this film, I think, is terribly symmetrical when it comes to ordering the actors. There's a kind of a symmetrical dance going on. So I introduced the next film. I don't have to now.
Okay, let's say this is the best explanation of the durable fascination that the film has had over generations. I always wondered, because I always had a problem with the social message of the film, which I find.
You mean that the rich people do good things?
Yes. That's always been a problem with me, but I agree. If the film has something, I would agree that that's it.
I don't think that the melodrama element of it has to be taken in the context of that moment in this episode. We're just on the turn of the century, from the 19th century, so you can imagine a certain influence on that narrative structure. But I think it's very, very interesting on many other levels other than the storyline.
Yes, interesting.
Anyhow, I have to thank you very much for being here. Thank you.